from NET, the National Educational Television Network.
I'd like to live in a tree-lined street. I'd like to have a summer home on the lake. I'd like to have a yacht and belong to a North Shore Yacht Club. I like to wear suits from Brooks Brothers. All Americans, and I am an American, we think this way. There's no other way to think. I can't think African. I can't think Irish. I can't think Norwegian. I have to think in the society in which I live, which is a white society. So their values are imposed on me, and I think this kind of way. I don't think of myself as being a Negro. Never until recently have I really been concerned that I am a Negro. I thought all the while that I was an American.
As a former star student of the esoteric who is deeply experienced and now firmly convinced of the potential spiritual pitfalls within the New Age movement, the Age of Aquarius, or the Aeon of Horus, I feel compelled to address the concerns surrounding these beliefs. There is a significant apprehension among those in Christian ministry, and it's crucial to understand these concerns. One prevailing critique centers on the perceived influence of the New Age movement within organizations like Freemasonry, often associated with the fixation on the Age of Aquarius. Critics argue that this concept serves as a covert vehicle to repackage and disseminate what they term Luciferianism to a global audience. This is a serious concern, and one that we should approach with caution and vigilance. Throughout history, influential mystic figures like Manly P. Hall, Aleister Crowley, Alice Bailey, formerly associated with the Lucifer Trust, now known as Lucis Trust, Madame Blavatsky, and Brother Annie Besant, have been linked to esoteric and occult beliefs, which some argue have connections to these New Age ideologies. While these associations may not be universally accepted, they underline the concerns expressed by many discerning observers regarding the spiritual nature of these movements. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, the Bible reminds us, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness?" This verse underscores the importance of maintaining a clear distinction between our faith in Christ and any spiritual beliefs or practices that could lead us away from the teachings of the Bible. While some individuals may be drawn to the ideas associated with the Age of Aquarius or the Aeon of Horus, it is our duty as people of the Most High God to encourage discernment, critical thinking, and a deep reliance on the Word of God. The Bible cautions us about deceptive teachings and the potential for spiritual deception. In 2 Corinthians 11:13-14, it warns that Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. It's crucial to address how New Age beliefs and practices can sometimes infiltrate our lives almost imperceptibly. The subtlety with which these ideas slip past our radar and into our homes is a matter of great concern. Often, they are presented as harmless, even attractive, self-help, or spiritual concepts that promise personal growth, inner peace, and enlightenment. Yet, beneath the surface, there can be profound deviations from faith in the Almighty. They may invade the home via books, computers, self-help workshops, or even from acquaintances who may be unaware of the spiritual dangers involved. Let's delve deeper into Alice Bailey's contributions to the New Age movement and the well-founded concerns from a Christian perspective regarding the potential dangers associated with her teachings. Alice Bailey's writings hold a central place in the New Age movement, particularly in her exploration of spiritual evolution and enlightenment. Her concepts, such as humanity's path toward higher consciousness and the upcoming Age of Aquarius, may be appealing to those seeking personal growth and spiritual development. However, from a Christian standpoint, there are deeply rooted concerns regarding Bailey's association with the Lucifer Trust, now known as Lucis Trust. Despite Bailey's intention to redefine Lucifer as a symbol of enlightenment and spiritual awakening, this interpretation directly contradicts traditional Christian beliefs. In Christian theology, Lucifer is often identified with Satan, the adversary of God, and the embodiment of evil. Consequently, Bailey's redefinition of Lucifer as a positive spiritual force is perceived as a significant deviation from orthodox teachings. These deviations can lead individuals away from the foundational truths in God's Word. Her burden was to evangelize the nations, and did so in her work through the United Nations. She was an evangelist for the Luciferian way. Those who go down that left-hand path profess that they serve the God of this world and not the God of heaven. They have convinced masses of people to serve that deceiving God and to rebel against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just as the devil himself had done. Most of them do so unintentionally. Their submission to every desire of their flesh has allowed many to adopt the creed of Aleister Crowley. They do what they will, when they want. They would never surrender to a lord, even if he was their bloodline ancestral king. Lucifer, rising. Even in the ghetto, little do they know, and godlessness follows.
Very interesting commentary on this in Life magazine several years ago when they had the sit-ins on Route 40 to try to stamp out discrimination. And they had asked a lady there who ran just a hash joint almost, why she discriminated against all of these black people when some of them were diplomats from African nations. And her comment was simply that they all looked like just plain run-of-the-mill niggas to her.
Introducing Marsha King.
This is Robert Jones, age 38, native-born American. He holds down an important job, owns a yacht that sleeps 8, and vacations each summer on fashionable Martha's Vineyard. He, his wife Marlene, and their 2 children live on a tree-lined suburban street just across the Hudson River from New York City. Bobby Jones, as his friends call him, is a graduate of New York University with a law degree from New York Law School. He and his family are among some 5 million members of a unique and little-known group in the United States, the Negro middle class. Bobby Jones and his counterparts are to be found in every state of the Union. 1 out of every 4 Negro families can be said to be middle class today, which is better than twice the figure of only 10 years ago. Most are still on the lower middle income rungs in the $7,000 to $15,000 a year category, though others, such as Bobby Jones, do much better. This is not to say, however, that the millennium has come. According to the United States Department of Labor Statistics, Negro median income is still little better than half that of whites, and whites' income is increasing at a faster rate.
happy.
Do is to get a complete and thorough review of this to make sure that we have everything in there. And at the same time, Bobby Jones, whose father was a post office worker in Boston, supervises a staff of 50, mostly whites. In the model cities staffing and budget items, we have included rehabilitation specialists. But does income alone determine what is understood by the term middle class?
The Negro is not a part of my family. As a result, I don't elect to have him sit and eat with me. As a result, I don't elect to have him belong to a club that I may belong to.
This whole history of white rioting and white violence historically buried. People think of violence and riots in the street. They always think of the 1960s when black people rioted, but when white people rioted, it doesn't even have a name.
There's still large segments of the country that are not going to first evaluate what I do, but they're just going to make snap judgments because my skin is not white.
Arise and shine, beautiful people arise.
The United States views a strong middle class, not just as an ideal, but as its proudest creation. But the black middle class is not and never has been the same as the white middle class. Whites talk about working hard and playing by the rules, but blacks have always had to play by a different, hateful set of hideously unfair rules. Working hard has never been enough for black Americans to flourish. Nearly 40% of all black children in America are poor. The black unemployment rate is twice that of whites. And the black middle class is far more fragile and has much less wealth than the white middle class. In fact, blacks are not even in the same league with whites when it comes to wealth. For every dollar of wealth in the hands of the average white family in America, the typical black family has just a little more than a nickel. It's not easy to get a handle on black America. There are an awful lot of African Americans doing awfully well.
This is for you, Billy.
Cultural heroes are commonplace. Black stars are dominant in the sports world. And there are fabulously successful African Americans in media and the fine arts.
The door tonight has been opened.
And of course, Barack Obama was elected to 2 terms as president. But at the same time, black America has been racked by terrible poverty.
Our voice won't be silenced no more.
Too much tragic violence and disastrous relations with law enforcement at every level.
I can't breathe. Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead.
Where does the middle class fit into this picture?
I think the perception of blacks in general is either what you see on TV. You have both ends of the spectrum. You see folks who are very poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods, or you see the blacks that are uber wealthy like you see on TV. There's nobody in the middle they have a nice home, they make a decent living, but they're not uber rich. And I think the perception is that there is no middle for us. I think the ones in the middle just kind of get dismissed or not even thought about.
But you're real.
We're here, we're real.
The black middle class is real, all right, but it's fragile. It's not the same as the white middle class.
White families have about $113,000 in financial assets or wealth, and that average African American family has $5,700. That's a pretty devastating gap.
80% of African Americans have a net worth below the median net worth of white Americans.
80%.
80%. Meaning that fundamentally, the notion of economic stability that middle class connotes is something that African Americans are still striving towards. About a third of African Americans have no assets.
Zero. To get a real understanding of why this is the case, we have to take a look back.
The dark brown shades of my skin only add color to my tears.
Ended, but things didn't change. People still lived on land that was owned by others. They still worked for profits that went to others. Working conditions were harsh. Children weren't getting educated. There was a lot of illness, early death, and people didn't see a way out. Sharecropping was nothing but slavery under a different name, and that was the status of a lot of black people.
The majority of the people who were doing sharecropping never cleared anything at the end of the year. So that this is something that kept people in debt to the landowner and debt to the planter, which meant that, for all intents and purposes, they were not much better off than their enslaved ancestors had been.
My grandmother's house was basically a wood cabin, and literally you could look through the floor and see the ground. My father would work from sunup to sundown, plowing fields, picking cotton, strawberries, tobacco. He was truly a sharecropping farmer, and back then got very, very little per day.
Sharecroppers often worked year after year for no money. They were cheated by landowners and had virtually no legal recourse.
They would take the kids out of school at an early age. To work the fields. To work the fields. You wouldn't. We were talking about when we ride up here, ride through all this land, somebody had to plow this land.
And they shut down the schools during harvest time so that the kids could come out and help with the harvest.
It's hard to imagine the growth of a healthy black middle class from this wretched soil.
There are many examples of Southern governors and lawmakers who would say, well, what would be the point of investing in education for these people who, when all we need them to be is a cook or domestic or to work in the field, how much education could they need?
James K. Vardaman was explicit on that point. Governor of Mississippi and then U.S. Senator in the early 1900s, he had sworn to lynch every black person in the state if necessary, to maintain white supremacy. The only effect of Negro education, Vardaman said, was to spoil a good field hand and make an insolent cook.
It was a regime of totalitarianism in some ways.
Whatever you had could be taken away the moment some white woman accused a black man of looking at her the wrong way. A white family thought that a black family was doing too well, getting uppity. People tried to exercise a few rights, suggest that they had them. Any of those things could get you lynched.
It was against the law for a black person and a white person to just play checkers together in Birmingham. Everything you could imagine was segregated. There were separate elevators, there were separate staircases, there were separate taxi cabs. And so that meant that at every turn, at every moment, every single thing that you did, you had to be keenly aware and observant and vigilant as to where you happened to be and making sure that you were not crossing the line. Any breach of that caste system could mean injury, attack, and even death.
The Ku Klux Klan.
And always there was the violence.
They terrorized Negroes and their sympathizers with violence, arson, and murder.
They took them and put them in jail and they beat them. And then they got together on a Saturday. And they tied them with barbed wire, hand and feet. They put barbed wire around the neck and put the father on one side of the bumper and the Negro and the son on the other side of the bumper. They drug them all over the town. And after that, they were drugged to the neighborhood, the Negro neighborhood. They were told that this is the way that we're going to keep the Negro in this place.
A black school teacher in Florida named Harry T. Moore tried to fight back against the systematic terror. In January 1944, he learned about a black teenage boy who'd had the temerity to send a Christmas card to a white girl. After she showed the card to her father, he and a group of his angry friends gathered. They seized the boy and forced his father to watch as they hogtied and tortured him, then drowned him in a river. Moore, founder of the local NAACP, and his wife Harriet spent their adult lives battling such outrages. They fought against mob violence and for equal pay for black teachers. At great personal peril, they tried to get black people registered to vote. Both were fired from their teaching jobs and blacklisted. They were not safe anywhere, least of all in their own home in rural Mims, Florida. On Christmas night, 1951, the Moores' 25th wedding anniversary, a bomb exploded under their bedroom as they slept. They were taken to a hospital 35 miles away. By the time the only available black doctor could be located, Harry T. Moore had died. Harriet said she had no desire to live without her husband. 8 days later, she also died. Even in that violent, hateful, repressive environment, some faint stirrings of a black middle class could be felt.
You had African-American professionals and business people, funeral parlors and undertakers. They served the African-American community. Their jobs and livelihood did not depend on working for a white company, a white family, or a white institution.
Mariel's mother, Sybil, a teacher and community leader in New Orleans, grew up in that environment.
We had a very comfortable life in this bubble where we were protected because we were among our own and dependent on our own. And there was a lot of entertaining. I guess we mimicked the white society. My mother entertained with organizations like the Lynx and the Boulé.
There are famous Boulé ministers in every major city. Some are designated to dissuade Bible believers from the way of the old-time religion and into what we know to be practices of the New Age. Though they may play the role of Christian, their allegiance is sworn to beings other than Christ. According to researchers and the scholars of the Brotherhood, the New Age is the age of Horus, or the Aeon of Horus. The title of New Age is truly a misnomer. The New Age religion is just the Babylonian or Egyptian mystery system in disguise. The majority of Boulé operatives, the guards of the boulevard, are not Christian and will be vocal against Christianity, naming it as a religion that is responsible for our former physical and present mental spiritual slavery. And this is a key aspect of their job and reason for being. The Divine Nine are collectively known as the Boulé, and it must be noted that all members of the Divine Nine are not a part of the Illuminati system. Researcher Elder Steve Coakley first brought the existence of the group to our collective attention in his series of tapes from the 90s and early 2000s.
Acronym, the Boulé, B-O-U-L-E. We will do our best to show you the information related to the Boulé. That's what this lecture is about. I could give the entire lecture and quote every inch of the documentation without looking at it. I know them that well. But this is my responsibility, my night, to show you the information so that you could look at it with me and double affirm the fact that much of our black press, as much as we like it, has not been honest in talking about this group of black men, for they respect it very highly and never speak negatively against it.
He said that through a slip of the lip made by none other than crossover comedian Dick Gregory. It was revealed that there was a small, select secret group within the vast membership of the Divine Nine. This group was referred to as the Boulé. The group started out as the intended quote-unquote Black Skull and Bones, or Black Illuminati, according to its Ivy League instigators. The information that you find online today is sterilized, whitewashed, blacked out, and scrubbed clean of the dirt that Elder Coakley collected for us as evidence. This evidence was gradually pointing out to all that the same so-called black stars and celebrities of this reality were actually agents of the Luciferian elite, collectively called by the misnomer Illuminati. What Crowley called the Aeon of Horus, Manly P. Hall thought of as the Age of Atlantis. Blavatsky wrote extensively about it and called it the Aquarian Age, in conjunction with astrology. The names changed, but the game stays the same. All of these are deceptive pseudonyms for the term New Age, which is in reality the Old Age or the ancient witchcraft revisited. No church will teach that these seemingly harmless New Age practices were taught to ancient man by way of the fallen, and each of the aesthetically innocent practices we call New Age has got a built-in feature that gives spiritually legal right to malevolent spirits. The right to do what, you ask? To violate you, dominate you, and claim your body as its own.
You were inside this secure bubble, and you stepped beyond, and it was another world. You knew your limitations. When a white person was walking on the sidewalk and a black would be walking toward them, they had to step down off the curb to let the white person pass. You knew what not to do. You knew not to step beyond the Louisiana laws.
But blacks who improved their lot were always at risk. A small enclave of prosperous black entrepreneurs in Tulsa, Oklahoma, became known as the Negro Wall Street. They had their own shops, banks, newspapers, restaurants, and theaters, the makings of a self-sustaining middle class. But in May 1921, riots broke out when blacks tried to stop an angry white mob from lynching a young black man. Black homes and businesses were attacked with firebombs and gunfire, and the National Guard was called up. The violence lasted 16 hours. When it was over, the Negro Wall Street was wiped out. The deprivation, the horrors, and the humiliation would eventually prove unbearable.
They tried the South, they tried to stay in the South, and after a while they were just done. Lynchings were still happening. Jim Crow was still very much there. Separate but equal was a joke. And a lot of people just said, let's just go north.
They came out of the South by the millions in search of a better life for themselves and their children. They carried very little besides the clothes on their back, a package with just enough food for their journey, and a dream. Unnoticed by most journalists, unacknowledged by early historians, their journey came to be known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was an outpouring of 6 million African Americans from the South to the North, the Midwest, and West. It was a search for freedom, a search for the ability to pursue their dreams for both themselves and for their children.
Their main objective was paid employment.
In the first part of the last century, the labor force, certainly of white males, was being siphoned off into the war effort.
Well, they were recruiting. The northern businesses, the northern industries, railroads, and the factories and the steel mills of the north needed labor, and they went to the south to find them because they were looking for the cheapest labor in the land, which would have meant African Americans. When the recruiters came, they actually had to take great care in doing so, because it turned out that there was great resistance in the South to this poaching
resistance among whites.
Yes.
Whites in the South did not want blacks to leave.
They did not want the labor to leave.
We have a good set of Negroes here, and they don't want to be disturbed. Of course, there are some getting some ideas, and that's all right. That's progress. But we've got some mighty good darkies here.
The Great Migration was the largest internal migration in America's history.
There are a lot of legendary railroad lines that we associate with the Great Migration now. The Illinois Central City of New Orleans is one of the most legendary railroad routes. There were 3 streams that the people used to escape. One was up the East Coast, which carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia and New York up the East Coast of our country. And then there was the Midwest stream from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Minneapolis. And then there was the West Coast stream, which carried people from Texas and Louisiana out to California, and then all the way up to Washington State and even beyond. Some people drove all the way out, particularly when they went out to the West Coast. It could be perilous because Jim Crow extended beyond the borders of the South. In many cases where if they were driving, they had to be very cautious. There were lots of places where they could not necessarily be assured of getting gas, could not be assured of getting a room for the night, could not be assured of being able to get food or to be able to eat it in a restaurant. So there were lots of obstacles and barriers that they had to overcome.
People didn't know that they were trading a challenging situation, a difficult situation, a harsh situation in the South, indeed for a new form of discrimination and exclusion, indeed in the North.
For one thing, the promise of good jobs was vastly overstated. Some blacks found lower echelon work in the factories of industrial cities, but for most, the only option was menial labor, sometimes of the most humiliating variety.
All right, James, let's get going, son.
This humiliation, accepted as normal by most whites, was often captured in the popular entertainment of the time.
Any more sandwiches?
Oh, sure, I got lots of them. Good night, Miss Will.
Black people really weren't allowed to get really good jobs. Domestic work overwhelmingly is what black women did.
My mother, she worked in a pickle factory, if I recall correctly, and then she did a lot of domestic work. Dad was a laborer, lifting drums, breathing chemicals all day.
Men participated in all sorts of, whether it was cutting grass, gardening, cooks, drivers, janitorial workers. The jobs that were at the very bottom of the economy substantially were held by African Americans. A good job was being a Pullman car porter.
Blacks considered Pullman porter to be a middle-class job.
The thing that made it middle class was that they were being paid relatively well, particularly compared to other African Americans, and they had a uniform and they were moving about with, important and respected people. So it was a revered occupation to have, and yet it's an indication that still essentially these were people who were servants.
For a lot of blacks, the only route to a decent job was self-employment. My family was a family of tradespeople. They were upholsterers. My mother was a seamstress, my father was an upholsterer, my grandfather was an upholsterer. I cannot believe that my grandfather's old upholstery shop is now this boutique restaurant. It used to say R.S. Herbert Upholstering, established 1927. This door right here, I came in and out of that door a million times when I was like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years old, right on up through high school. I used to work here after school. This place was really important to my family because my grandfather owned the shop during the Depression, and he had 5 kids, and it kept his family from being destitute. In those days in Montclair, if you were black, there was not much in the form of gainful employment to be had. But if you had a business, that was different. And my grandfather had a business. Largely shut out of private employment, the real route to the middle class for overwhelming numbers of blacks was government employment, as teachers in black neighborhoods, for example, or lower-level municipal workers, or in the post office.
The post office not only offered a good career in and of itself, but you could get a part-time job at the post office. You could teach during the day and you could sort mail at night. You could put together a pretty decent living.
My grandfather got a good government job. He was the driver of a trash truck in Norwalk, Connecticut, which I guess was supposed to be somewhat prestigious that you were the driver, not actually picking up the trash. They were able to buy a home in Norwalk. They always said that they had a great life. Like in my dad's mind, they didn't consider themselves poor. By some people's standards, they might have, but they didn't consider themselves poor.
In that era, which lasted through much of the 20th century, it didn't matter if you were black, how smart you were, or how hard you worked. Blacks were seen as a servant class, and that's the way they were treated. Even highly accomplished black professionals had a hard time making it into the middle class. Black doctors were shunned by white patients and were not allowed to practice in white hospitals or join white medical associations. Sybil Moriel's father was a doctor.
My father grew up on a farm. He went to Straight College, which is now Dillard University, but there was no medical school here. So he went to Howard University, and he interned at Freedman's Hospital. He came home and opened a practice. But what's interesting is that they could not take their patients or even set foot in the white hospitals.
I'll never forget, I went to my 6th grade counselor. He said, what do you want to be? I said, I want to be a lawyer. And he said, you can never be a lawyer. He said, your father is a laborer. He didn't go very far in school. Your mama didn't either. He said, there's no way. He said, I think you need to aim a little lower. And then he said these words that have lived with me in for every day of my life. He asked me the question, who do you think you are?
So this counselor is essentially slamming the door on the dream of a 6th grader.
That's right.
Instead of opening the door.
Yeah. So I found my whole life, almost everything I did was trying to prove him wrong.
Z. Scott is a former federal prosecutor who grew up in deeply segregated Shreveport, Louisiana, and now lives in Chicago. When she graduated from law school, a career in corporate law was virtually out of the question.
The opportunities were limited. At the time, most lawyers of color were in government because there were no opportunities in private practice.
So you basically couldn't get a job.
The stories you hear of, I went into a law firm for an interview. When I walked through the door, the person interviewing me looked at me, didn't want to take my coat. When I sat down, they spent the rest of the interview telling me how horrible it was to work there. And then I got my coat and I left. That wasn't the only time I had that sort of experience where a couple of interviews in, this is not a welcome place.
So it was pretty much a government job or bust.
That was pretty much it.
The quest for a black middle class, severely hampered by the lack of decent employment, was made all the more horrendous by the vicious and often violent refusal of whites to allow blacks into decent housing. It was a crisis faced immediately by blacks who were part of the Great Migration.
Chicago, for example, the neighborhoods that African Americans had moved into had previously been lived in by waves of Lithuanians or Italians or Greek immigrants. That housing stock had been old to begin with and not necessarily maintained very well because these have been rentals. And then when African Americans arrived, they arrived in such large numbers that the owners ended up subdividing those homes to make what they would call kitchenette apartments, where there would be sometimes multiple families living in a 2 or 3 room apartment sharing a kitchenette. They were actually paying more per square foot than almost anyone else in the city, not because of the high quality of the housing, but because the demand was so great that the landlords could charge them more for less. And then on top of that, where they were living, they were actually considered the vice districts of these cities, where they might never have chosen to be, but these were the only neighborhoods that they were permitted to live in.
This is the first building on this block where a white owner sold to a black resident. This was a solidly white area, and it was a solidly white block, and Chicago's a very segregated city, and there was a very small area where black people lived. It was called the Black Belt.
We're talking about a narrow strip, roughly from about 35th Street down to about 47th Street. That's where all African Americans were in the city of Chicago.
The black families are not allowed into the suburbs. They called it the Chicago Wall, the wall around Chicago keeping black people in.
When the first Negroes began to move in, a kind of collective panic seized the white residents, most of whom were of Irish descent. It seemed to be taken for granted that there was no possibility of white and black living side by side in peace and harmony. No attempt was made to integrate the newcomers into the white community.
There were instances when blacks began to move onto a block where you would see an open amount of hostility to that family moving into the block.
From the mid-1940s on, there were a series of riots, usually thousands of people massing around one building where a black family had moved.
A Negro bus driver, Harvey Clark, rented an apartment here on July 11th, 1951.
Clark, an Army veteran, and his wife Janetta tried to move outside the Black Belt of Chicago to Cicero.
He was a bus driver. She was taking care of their two young children. They had been living in that narrow band of space to which African Americans were consigned on the south side of Chicago at that time. They were actually living in an apartment that they shared with another family. And so when they found this apartment, they were thrilled to be able to find a place that was actually convenient to his work. And upon arrival, they were met with the sheriff and other authorities who would not permit them to go in. They then had to go and get a court order to move into the apartment that they had already rented. They returned with the court order to move in. But as they were moving in, there was a crowd that began to swell. At one point, there were 4,000 people who gathered around them, so hostile that they were not permitted to actually move in themselves that night. And after they left, some people in the mob went into the apartment, ransacked it, and hurled out of the window the sofa, the chairs, the table. They ended up wrenching the radiators and the faucets and the toilets and the sinks out of the wall and hurling them out of the window.
Just like a crazed mob.
A crazed mob. And then after they did that, they then set the whole building afire so that no one could live in the building.
They hurled fire bombs, rocks, and bottles at the building. Before the disturbance was over, martial law had been declared in the area. In all, 23 persons were injured, a dozen others arrested.
As more people arrived, they began to push the boundaries further and further as to where they could live, merely because they were bursting with little in the way of options to where they were. As they attempted to leave, that's when they ran into the redlining and the restrictive covenants that meant that they were not able to move as freely as they might have hoped.
Well, the redlining is remarkably descriptive. Insurance companies and banks had maps where they literally drew red lines on the map around neighborhoods. And so this is an area that we are not going to lend in. Typically what would happen is that a bank or an insurance company would make a decision about the racial composition of the neighborhood. So if it began to transition to an African American neighborhood, it was deemed as too risky. Right, too risky to grant mortgages in that neighborhood or to insure properties.
In those days, banks were local. Typically, most banks operated in one town. So there was also an unwritten code that said we won't rent to, we won't sell to, we won't finance a home that an African American wants to buy. Indeed, real estate agents wouldn't even show homes to African Americans in, quote, non-African American neighborhoods. So you had officialdom plus custom working hand in hand to maintain a system of just outright exclusion and denial. I mean, it was truly an American system of apartheid.
The federal government would not insure FHA loans for black people. It was written in their handbook. And then because of that, the banks followed suit, and they just did not make regular mortgages or conventional mortgages to anybody that was living within certain red line districts.
Because banks refused to loan, black people were left with the alternative of buying on contract, which is essentially the same as buying on an installment plan.
There are blocks like this scattered throughout the Lawndale section of Chicago's West Side Ghetto. The people who live here bought their homes from real estate speculators at double or triple their value, and they bought on contract because they couldn't get conventional or FHA mortgages. Under the contract, the buyer makes installment payments at high interest, but he bills no equity. If he defaults on even one payment at any time during the contract, he loses the property and everything he's paid into it.
It was Jack McNamara who organized college students to do property research, one property at a time, and they did every property in this 8-block surrounding area, and they found out all had been sold on contract, all had suffered immense markups, and everyone living here was struggling to make those payments.
If you have a $25,000 contract and the FHA appraisal is for $15,000, you're paying interest on $10,000 more than you should be paying.
We have good information that at least $500 million was legally stolen from the black community in Chicago alone during the period between 1940 and 1970.
Contract sellers and other speculators were making so much money they began to deliberately panic whites into leaving their neighborhoods.
Speculators understood that if they can get the whites who lived here to leave, they could turn around and resell the properties at a very significant markup to black people who wanted these nice, beautiful brick homes.
So they essentially came here and provoked the homeowners into selling their property.
Right. What would happen is a salesman would go to your door and say, "Hi, are you interested in selling?" And you'd say, "No, not really." They'd say, "Fine, you don't want to sell? Don't worry. I'll be back in a week and I'll offer you $1,000 less. But fine, no problem. Just wait it out if you'd like to. You should know, blacks are coming. Your home will be worth less very soon. Sell now, get out while you can." Often middle-class black families would be the first to move into a white area.
4338, that's the address.
What happened here, it's a good example of the kind of violence that black families faced. This particular house was purchased in 1959 by a black couple, Josh and Barbara Hargrave, and they had 4 children. They could afford to move to this area. They put in $9,000 down payment at a time when $1,000 down payment was considered quite good. Once they moved into the property and people saw who was living there, you had 3 days of rioting in the streets, up to from 1,000 to 5,000 white people in the streets, stoning the building, throwing lighted torches at the building. People would go around to the back porch, which is wooden, and try to set fire to it. They were chanting, "We want blood. You know, get out of here. We don't want you here."
So these riots became a common occurrence.
They were common. People talked about it summer after summer. This whole history of white rioting and white violence has been historically buried. When people think of violence and riots in the street, they always think of the 1960s when black people rioted. But when white people rioted, it doesn't even have a name.
My understanding is that when these mobs just sort of got out of control, they would be screaming the worst kinds of things.
And that was quite traumatic for parents and children alike. Parents who don't want their children to hear such a thing. Imagine seeing this. So yeah, they'd be screaming, "Nigger, go home," "Die, nigger, die." In other neighborhoods in Chicago, they had little chants like, "I wish I was an Alabama trooper. That's what I would like to be, because if I was an Alabama trooper, I could murder niggers legally." Martin Luther King, when he came to Chicago, said that people in Mississippi should come to Chicago to learn how to hate.
How do you feel about this reception, sir?
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
Hi. It's time for another message from the New World Order. We need to talk about our economy and your future in our world order.
First, we occupy
Wall Street. Little demonstration with people all in a tizzy have failed.
No.
Here's an order. You must be safe.
We control your
television, the media, internet.
We control
the world. We control the economy. We control you. There isn't any debate about it. Excuse me, there is no doubt. You.
Can you stand us?
Go back to work.
The New World Order. Thank you.
What's you?
One of the heartbreaking things about the whole situation was that basically black people and white people were pursuing the same middle-class values. They wanted to save money, they wanted to invest in a property that they could take care of and call their own. But when white people did that, they were rewarded, as you would expect, with usually property appreciation and a sense of stability. But when black people followed the same identical path of attempting to save and invest, they were punished. It becomes a method of luring them into a trap that will end up draining them of wealth instead of helping them to build wealth.
This project represents the future of a great city.
One of the responses to the influx of people from the south to the north was the federal government with local governmental authorities built these massive public housing developments. Cabrini Green, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, these massive concentrations. When you look at the old brochures and sales pitches that were made, what people were told is that these were going to be well kept, as nice as any penthouse, that there were going to be services provided, that this was going to be improved housing, and it was going to be temporary housing. And to some extent, people were sold a bill of goods, and it became almost a sanctioned warehousing.
While law and custom kept blacks warehoused in inner cities, the mammoth federal interstate highway system, financed by taxpayers, was opening up suburbs all across the country. This created enormous amounts of both good jobs and new housing. But once again, African Americans were left out. Blacks were not welcome in the construction and other trades, and they were systematically prevented from moving into the suburbs. For example, they were kept out of the affordable Levittown communities in New York and Pennsylvania. These gateways to the middle class were initially marked white only. It wasn't until 1957 that the first black family bought a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania. A film captured some of the reaction.
A major factor is fear.
I came from a small town where we didn't have any colored people.
Fear of economic loss.
Well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any numbers.
And fear of intermarriage.
They have told my children that they have to marry niggers.
6 decades have passed, and the Levittowns are still nearly entirely white. In those days, even ads in the newspapers for rentals would say, whites only, white tenancy. And this is in Montclair, New Jersey in the 1950s and 60s. We're not talking about the South. We're not talking about Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee.
I sure don't want any of them for neighbors. They're dirty and they're scary. Besides, my mother and father say the value of our house will go down. They'll ruin the neighborhood.
If I went to a school where I wasn't wanted, I'd leave, buddy. I'd leave.
Yes, sir.
Gee, Dad.
Now, just a minute. Look,
But, Dad...
Look, son, I'm telling you, they have no ambition. Other minority groups have broken through. This is America. If they had anything on a ball, they could make it. If they don't, it's their own fault. No one ever gave me anything. I made it because I deprived myself of everything until I was successful.
Honey, I just don't see how you can feel like that.
All right, I admit it. They were great, but I still don't like them. I still say colored people's skin is different. It's dirty and it smells.
Oh, Stacy.
You want freedom? I want money, not no welfare tax. Power.
If God wanted them white, he would have made them white. I don't see why they have to make such a big fuss about everything. They don't like it here. Why don't they go back to Africa, where they came from?
You don't understand. Don't tell me they're not lazy. All they want to do is to get onto welfare and make money for doing nothing.
I'll tell you why they're rioting. Because they're too lazy to work and pay for the things that I have to work and pay for.
Incidentally, I can't tell you what to hunt with your own gun. I just sell them. But I can tell you, I got 3 of them stashed in my house. And I can't wait for them coons to try and ride around here. Right?
Right. You think they were kidding when they said burn, baby, burn?
No, baby, they weren't kidding when they said burn, baby, burn.
We're coming to an area where my father had 2 stores in the 1960s and 70s on Main Street in Orange, New Jersey. In those days, this was a pretty thriving middle-class business district. My father was one of the few black business owners. So the main reason these shops did so well had to do with the clientele, most of whom came from the suburbs. That's where the money was, that's where my father's customers came from, and we were just up there all the time, giving estimates, fitting slip covers, measuring for draperies, carrying furniture out to be reupholstered. They were heady times for my old man and for my mom. What they needed, though, and what my father wanted, was to expand. So I would be with him when he was talking with other business owners. These were white business owners who had larger businesses than my father. And they liked my old man, and they liked the work that he did. And so they would say, Chester, you have to expand your business. And they'd say, get a bank loan. It's so funny, you know, get a bank loan. He needed to raise capital, so the answer was get a bank loan. Well, he couldn't get a bank loan. They weren't giving bank loans to guys who looked like my father.
Here is Mr. Adams with the president of the Elmville National Bank.
Well, I think we can make you this loan, and this is where you sign.
It wasn't just the private sector throwing up these maddening roadblocks. In 1935, Congress enacted Social Security only after Southern segregationists were assured its benefits would not go to agricultural and domestic workers, the jobs held by most blacks. So, for example, a woman could work faithfully for 40 years as a maid and then retire with no pension, no Social Security, no money at all. Blacks fought valiantly in World War II, but when they came home, they found that in many states, especially in the South, they were being denied the benefits of the GI Bill. Those benefits lifted millions of whites into the middle class in the years after the Second World War. I frankly found it remarkable that blacks were able to establish any kind of economic foundation in the U.S. With every improvement in their economic or social circumstances, black Americans met resistance from white supremacists. And yet, by the mid-1960s, a significant black middle class existed, and it was growing.
After getting all that he could from Dick Gregory, without alerting Mr. Gregory, Elder Steve researched suspected members and scoured through documents, and came to several conclusions that have stood up to be factual in the eyes of the unbiased observer. 1. There was an elite power structure, a government within a government, a secret group. 2. This group had plans to eliminate much of the world's population through a variety of means. 3. This group's means not only included occult practices, but their focus likely centered around and relied upon occult practices. 4. This group had special concerns and specific provisions aimed at specific, potentially threatening groups. Then, these select blacks would get invited into social political inner circles, private clubs, and fraternal orders, all of which have an oath or some other kind of binding agreement in place. Social circles, private clubs, and fraternal orders all require membership, which can be revoked, along with special privileges, which can also be revoked if an initiate is considered disobedient. This was also true of the Communist Party, which attracted many blacks, especially during the rise of 1960s and 70s black nationalism, due to its socialism and lack of belief in God. The most logical and natural place to find them is where they were already being bred and prepped for the job. Historically, black universities and colleges. Step 1 in trauma-based mind control is to introduce the trauma. It was not enough that these select, elite recruits were born and raised in the same environment that produces the consistently traumatized people that these initiates would be incentivized to spy upon and suppress. To add insult to injury, additional trauma is introduced through the hazing or other initiation processes, like we truthers often mistakenly tend to do concerning the Freemasons. We often throw the blanket over one entire group, like the Boule, when there are only some members of its ranks who knowingly work against the better interests of spiritual, mental, and physical freedom. The NWO will use any convenient dupe or otherwise compromised individual as a recruit. They also recruit the criminally involved as well as the criminally insane, and recruit ops from the slums to the suburbs in order to sabotage up-and-coming movements and get close to key targets in the community. Brother Coakley's work is a point of reference marking a period when we began to not only abandon the idea of white supremacy having any power over us, but we also adopted a refreshingly new attitude and an advanced level of mental freedom. Now, he would say, we can get to the bottom of things and get beyond blaming white folk for their part in our adversity or their complacency. Now we know there are spies among us.
In the summer of 1978, I interviewed a man who worked as an informer for the FBI during the 1960s. His name is Dothard Perry, also known as Ed Riggs, also known as Bill Perry, also known as Othello.
How were you paid?
The pay was always in cash. Cash, and you would sign a card. It would go like this. A rendezvous or a drop-off point would be picked out either by yourself or the agent. You would meet the agent there. Usually it would be in a vehicle. You get in the vehicle, he would hand you the money. He would tell you first to count the money. He would tell you the amount while you counted it. If the amount was there, he would then bring out a card. On that card would be for the week of such and such. In other words, the week was dated. So-and-so has been paid the amount of. Then you would sign the card, and then the agent would sign the card. The reason for this is that if all of a sudden the IRS became very interested about where you were getting all this extra money from, you could always tell them to go back to the Bureau, and the Bureau would have your cards on file.
I see. Were there such things as bonuses?
Oh, yes.
What were they paid for?
Bonuses were paid for, suppose while you were meeting with, or you were at a meeting with Bobby Seals, Chulai of the Red Army happened to come to the meeting too, which is something which would be a new development. That's bonus time.
In other words, a hot piece of information.
Hot piece, very hot piece.
Did you ever suffer pangs of conscience?
Quite a few times. Quite a few times. I still suffer pains of conscience. I suffer from the fact that a lot of people trusted me, and I misused that trust. I suffer from the fact that a lot of information that I gave out was the undoing of certain groups or certain people. I suffer from the fact that I'm on the run constantly. I have no real life to speak of.
You have no family life, really? You have a wife?
No, I don't have a wife. I do have a child. I can't see her that often. I have to stay away from them because once I come around, the Bureau shows up and harassment starts. I have very few close personal friends, no one to really confide in. It's like being on the outside of a glass jar and everything is happening inside the jar, but you're on the outside. You can see it happening, but you can't participate.
Why have you decided to talk to me?
For the simple reason, I think this information should be getting out, should be put out to the public. I think not only black people, but everyone should become aware of what your so-called law enforcement agencies do to so-called enforce the law. Because between you, myself, and the audience, I've seen more felons in law enforcement than I have in prison.
Many would say, well, look, you yourself just got through saying that the DLA was involved in criminal activity. What's wrong with wanting to put them in prison? How would you answer them?
I would answer them in this way. First off, we have to understand why they did what they did. But I'm not even going to go off into that psychological hoo-ha. What I'm going to say is when you become just as bad as the people that you go after, then there's nothing gained and a whole lot lost.
You also were active in the infiltration of many cultural groups. Before we go into that step by step, how much research and study did the FBI engage in of black culture in the late 60s?
A great amount.
Give me an idea.
From the thing is, I can, they have a file on every type of magazine that blacks read. They have a file on the music.
Music?
Music, dance, theater, actors, comedians, you name it, man.
And they would actually study these different...
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely.
What would they do with music?
To understand the people, you have to understand the culture. To infiltrate, you have to understand. You had a lot of so-called white liberals that were infiltrating the so-called black groups using the information that they had gathered from the studies of blacks.
You mean just to understand the behavior pattern of our people?
Oh, yeah. I can, Will Heaton could name out some jams of Miles Davis that I hadn't even heard of. He could name off some books that I hadn't even read pertaining to black culture.
Do you ever see agents actually studying the music of...
Yes, yes. Yes, I've seen them going over even video portion of cultural events. The understanding, like when, okay, you have an organization like Leroy Jones Black House. You remember that? Okay, Leroy Jones's place, which was done on the thing of tribalism. That's where I first heard the word Kintu, Mantu, Huntu, Hentu. These words of the African continuum. I learned that from an agent. He ran it down to me. they make in-depth studies of the personalities of the people they're dealing with, too, culturally. It always helps. It's a thing of, you can take their culture and use it against them.
How large would you say an extensive collection on our culture would you say the FBI has? Would you rate it as large as a particular library, like the Schomburg Library in Harlem? Or
I would rate it better. I would rate it better, and the fact is that they go into details that we probably would overlook. Will Heaton used to meet me in different places, you know. Will Heaton, that was one of my supervising agents. There is a certain bar in the Los Angeles area where people into black cultural things met, and Will Heaton used to meet me there. And he would go into very long and tiring conversations with some very articulate brothers about culture, African culture, and Afro-American culture.
Tell me about some of the cultural organizations that you infiltrated and what you did.
PASLA, Mafunde, Watts Writers Workshop, which they had.
The Watts Writers Workshop?
Yes. Watts Writers Workshop, which was one of the oldest established black writers workshop.
That place was burned down.
Yeah. The Bureau had it burnt down.
How do you know that?
I know because I participated. I did the arson.
You burned down the Watts Writers Workshop?
Yes.
Why did they want it to go?
At the time, funding had been cut to the workshop, had been cut out, but it looked like there was a possibility of a grant being given back to the workshop. And if there was no theater, there would be no grant.
The Reverend Al Sharpton is revealing how he worked with the FBI in the mid-1980s. The TV host and activist said yesterday that he did record conversations with alleged mobsters. The Smoking Gun website has documents calling Sharpton a confidential informant for the Bureau. At a news conference yesterday, Sharpton insisted he wasn't a rat.
In my own mind, I was not an informant.
Good evening to you. I'm Christine Johnson.
And welcome, everyone. I'm Maurice Dubois. Those stories are straight ahead. But first, after all these years, the Reverend Al Sharpton admits he was an FBI informant.
Yes, he says that he was the cat that got the rats. But others say that Sharpton's secret life was not by choice.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
I believe it's a risk that we must take for the net gain, because I believe it's always going to be there. Now, let's say that we abolish the CIA. It's done so many bad things. Let's don't ever have this kind of intelligence organization again. Do you know what's going to happen? American presidents are strong-willed men. They wouldn't be in that office if they weren't. If they don't have an intelligence service, they're going to create their own. It may not be very big, and they may reach into the loony bin to find the people to run it, and they may call it the plumbers, but they will have it.
This is ABC, the American Broadcasting Company.
This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.
This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low.
Now, back to New York.
People who have seen Times Square celebrations before declare that this is the biggest spectacle in New York history. Estimates of the crowd go beyond 500,000.
The CIA was set up first to collect intelligence and to analyze intelligence, to centralize intelligence, to get it all together so it could be all looked at together in the best academic tradition. Also, however, it was set up in order to struggle at that subversive level with the subversive forces that we faced.
The CIA from the very beginning, at least as early as 1951, has used the information that it has collected. And it has used the information in order to penetrate and to manipulate the institutions of power in whatever country it is operating in order to influence the course of events in those countries. And essentially this boils down to propping up those forces which are considered to be the friendly forces, and in penetrating, dividing, weakening, and ultimately destroying those forces which are considered to be the enemy forces.
The CIA had developed a program to assassinate Lumumba under Devlin's encouragement and management. The program they developed, the operation, didn't work. They didn't follow through on it. It was to give poison to Lumumba, and they couldn't find a setting in which to get the poison to him successfully in a way that it wouldn't appear to be a CIA operation. I mean, you couldn't invite him to a cocktail party and give him a drink and have him die a short time later, obviously. And so they gave up on it. They got cold feet. And instead, they handled it by the chief of station talking to Mobutu about the threat that Lumumba posed, and Mobutu going out and killing Lumumba, having his men kill Lumumba.
And what about the CIA's relationship with Mobutu? Were they paying him money?
Yes, indeed. I was there in 1968 when the chief of station told the story about having then, the day before, that day, having gone to make a payment to Mobutu of cash, $25,000, and Mobutu saying, "Keep the money. I don't need it." And by then, of course, Mobutu's European bank account was so huge that 25,000 was nothing to him.
The CIA works through the reactionary forces, essentially, or the middle roading or the social democratic forces, whichever ones they're trying to support. They work through these people. In the CIA, there is a distinction made between the career U.S. citizen employees, like I was, that is the officers and staff, and the people who actually do the work at the end of the line, who are the agents.
An agent is a person who is recruited and hired to perform a specific intelligence or covert action task in a particular area at a particular moment in time. And so he is, or she, is an indigenous person.
One time in particular, the chief of China branch had come to my window to draw funds, and he was drawing funds for death benefits for a person by the name of Dave who had been sent to China as an agent. And he said, "Well, we lost another body today." And I said, "Well, this seems like a very callous way to talk about a human life." And he said, "Well, Jim, we can't let our emotions interfere with our operational effectiveness."
One of my favorite agents, a charming individual who looked and acted, as a matter of fact, very much like Flip Wilson. He's quite talented and just a pleasure and a delight to be around. I left the country reassigned, and a week or two later he was executed, shot by the police, just picked him up and shot him without trial. And he would not have been shot if he had not been working for me during this period of time.
The situation that an intelligence officer faces when he attempts to get someone to serve the interests of the United States rather than the interests of his own country is precisely the kind of thing that a con man is doing when he's working on the mark. The only person who doesn't know what the game is when con men are working is the mark. The only person who really doesn't know what the game is in an intelligence recruitment is the target of that recruitment.
Some of the jobs of intelligence are ones which can best be performed by people who are themselves a little devious, so they can get at the root of the matter. If you wanted to invite a dozen people to spend the rest of your life with you on a desert island, I wouldn't suggest that you invite a bunch of spies. But I believe someone has to do intelligence work, so I did it.
My first job in the CIA after the training program was over was to do name checks for all of the prospective name checks of all of the prospective Venezuelan employees of the Creole Petroleum Company. Name checks means that a name is taken, and in this case I got all of these names from our office in Caracas, Venezuela, and I would check the names against all of the CIA files, which are computerized and mechanized, searching for possible indications of left-wing political sympathies or membership. On those that I found data, I would send that back to Caracas, where it would be turned over to the Creole office in Caracas, and those people wouldn't be hired. It's worth saying that the Creole Petroleum Company is one of the principal subsidiaries abroad of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, Exxon, which, as we all know, is a pillar of the Rockefeller family fortune. This is a specific example of the CIA assisting outright a multinational corporation. But in general terms, everything that the CIA is doing in the propaganda area and in the political warfare area tends in one way or another to help create the optimum operating conditions for multinational corporations in that particular country.
My position was going to be administrator and organizer for the Postal Telegraph Telephone International, which was later on I learned that it was one of these phony organizations under the CIA. My boss was Wallace Legge, who was one of John McCone's top hands. John McCone at that time was the head of the CIA. So your job is to organize within the U field as a communicator to organize against the communists. Later on, after I got trained in New York, I felt, well, it was a brainwash type of thing. I became a very fanatic. I was a real fanatic then.
There have been some people who have accused the AFL-CIO of collaborating with the CIA, and what would be your response to that accusation?
I think that is so ridiculous and so infantile, so juvenile to make such an accusation.
And you, Mr. Doherty?
Oh, I agree. I don't know of any labor leader that wouldn't out and out deny such an accusation. It's just not true.
In Latin America, one of the principal and most effective of the trade unionists, of the American trade unionists who worked with us, was Bill Doherty. He had originally started in the Post Telegraph and Telephone Workers International, coming up through the Communications Workers of America. Later on, he was transferred into the American Institute for Free Labor Development. This was set up during the Kennedy period and is a joint effort by American trade unionists like George Meany and the heads of American-based multinational corporations which operate in Latin America. The cover for this type of activity is indeed education and social projects, such as the development of cooperatives and housing. But the real reason is to create cadres of organizers who, after their training in the AIFLD is over, they can go back to their industries and spend 1 year or 2 years or even longer doing nothing but organizing.
And this is the 75th class that has graduated from Front Royal from the time that we started the programs out there. This particular group has been studying democratic trade unionism. It is our hope that they will go back to their respective countries and put into practice some of the things that they have learned while they were here at Front Royal.
Concluding our luncheon today, and wishing you, not only in my name, but in the name of President George Meany of the AFL-CIO.
Dándoles no solamente en nombre mío, sino en nombre del presidente George Meany de la AFL-CIO.
I'd like to leave you a thought in Spanish.
Quisiera dejarles con un pensamiento en español.
That comes from one of the great political and one of the great literary geniuses of this century and of the past century in Latin America.
De uno de los grandes figuras políticas y literarias de este siglo.
The true liberator of his country.
El auténtico libertador de su país.
From heaven, who is embarrassed by the shame that now now exists in Cuba because of the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
El cielo que pase vergüenza por la dictadura que actualmente existe en la Cuba de Fidel
That
Castro.
great Cuban Jose Marti one time said,
Ese gran cubano José Martí una vez dijo,
El mundo se divide en dos ramos.
the world is divided into two camps.
Los que aman y construyen.
Those who love and build.
Los que odian y destruyen.
And those who hate and destroy.
Nosotros, compañeros sindicalistas libres, somos que amamos y construimos. Váyanse con Dios, compañeros.
We are the lovers and builders. Go with God.
We were unsuccessful in our efforts to weaken the left in Uruguay during the period when I was in Uruguay, 1964 to 1966. Our job, in the face of the growth of the strength of the left during that period, was to promote repression. It was the only alternative we had.
Let me tell you why I do it. And because I don't want to wash dishes. I don't want to drive a truck. I don't want to carry a lunch bucket from 8 to 5, 9 to 5, and have a 15-minute coffee break between 10 o'clock and whatever. It just isn't my style.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
The world is tired of political fanaticism. It is weary of the lies, propaganda, and hysteria created by dictatorship. It is disgusted by the practice of torture and political assassination.
Yes, good. But am I winning or losing?
Losing, Senator.
Losing? But why? The computers had me ahead last December.
It checks out on both computers, plus the one we have as a safety valve backstopping cross-check. If the elections were held today, you would lose by 1.846 percentile.
1.846 percentile. Oh, yes. The computers don't lie.
Isn't there a possible breakthrough with any of the peer groups? How are we doing on the Jewish vote?
The senator's solid with the Jews, Mrs. Hennington. The Negroes are the trouble spot.
The Negroes. I'm the best friend those people have in Washington.
The computers indicate a sharp decline immediately after your law and order speech last winter.
All right. Now, let's see if we can come up with some ideas here. First, how do we retrieve the lost black vote?
Gil, why don't we accuse the CIA of a racially discriminatory hiring policy? They have no Negroes, except on a menial level, you know.
Certain, Belinda. I mean, that may be it.
I'm positive, but I'll check it out with our man over at Personnel.
Good.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me.
The spook who sat by the door. The controversial best-selling novel now becomes a shocking screen reality. The story of the first black agent in the CIA.
Whoever they select will be the best-known spy since 007.
Their first mistake was letting him in.
And let me congratulate you on being the first Negro officer in the Central Intelligence Agency.
Their worst mistake was letting him out.
You really want to mess with Whitey? I can show you how.
For 5 years, he was their token Negro.
Freeman, you people must serve.
For 5 years, he kept his cool.
Man, you just don't belong. I think you'd be happier with a mop in your hands. It's like your mama.
And in return, they taught him how to spy, how to fight, how to kill. For 5 years, he was the spook who sat by the door. And then he turned gangs of ghetto kids into a highly trained guerrilla army.
We live off the land. We match technology with spontaneity and improvisation. Men against machines, brains against computers. Now, if you don't think it can work, you check out Algeria, Kenya, Korea, and Iran. Can you dig it?
He turned a summer riot into a revolution.
This is not about hate white folks. It's about loving freedom enough to die or kill for it if necessary.
He turned the American dream into a nightmare. Yesterday, a novel. Today, a movie. The spook who sat by the door.
And the mayor's office is now air-conditioned, courtesy of the Black Freedom Fighters of Chicago.
These select blacks would get invited into social political inner circles, private clubs, and fraternal orders, all of which have an oath or some other kind of binding agreement in place. Social circles, private clubs, and fraternal orders all require membership, which can be revoked, along with special privileges, which can also be revoked if an initiate is considered disobedient. This was also true of the Communist Party, which attracted many blacks, especially during the rise of 1960s and 70s black nationalism, due to its socialism and lack of belief in God. The most logical and natural place to find them is where they were already being bred and prepped for the job. Historically, black universities and colleges. Step 1 in trauma-based mind control is to introduce the trauma. It was not enough that these select, elite recruits were born and raised in the same environment that produces the consistently traumatized people that these initiates would be incentivized to spy upon and suppress. To add insult to injury, additional trauma is introduced through the hazing or other initiation processes, like we truthers often mistakenly tend to do concerning the Freemasons. We often throw the blanket over one entire group, like the Boule, when there are only some members of its ranks who knowingly work against the better interests of spiritual, mental, and physical freedom. The NWO will use any convenient dupe or otherwise compromised individual as a recruit. They also recruit the criminally involved as well as the criminally insane, and recruit ops from the slums to the suburbs in order to sabotage up-and-coming movements and get close to key targets in the community. Brother Coakley's work is a point of reference marking a period when we began to not only abandon the idea of white supremacy having any power over us, but we also adopted a refreshingly new attitude and an advanced level of mental freedom. Now, he would say, we can get to the bottom of things and get beyond blaming white folk for their part in our adversity or their complacency. Now we know there are spies among us. There are famous Boule ministers in every major city. Some are designated to dissuade Bible believers from the way of the old-time religion and into what we know to be practices of the New Age. Though they may play the role of Christian, their allegiance is sworn to beings other than Christ. According to researchers and the scholars of the Brotherhood, the New Age is the age of Horus, or the Aeon of Horus. The title of New Age is truly a misnomer. The New Age religion is just the Babylonian or Egyptian mystery system in disguise. The majority of Boule operatives, the guards of the boulevard, are not Christian and will be vocal against Christianity, naming it as a religion that is responsible for our former physical and present mental spiritual slavery. And this is a key aspect of their job and reason for being. The Divine Nine are collectively known as the Boule, and it must be noted that all members of the Divine Nine are not a part of the Illuminati system. researcher Elder Steve Coakley first brought the existence of the group to our collective attention in his series of tapes from the 90s and early 2000s. He said that, through a slip of the lip made by none other than crossover comedian Dick Gregory, it was revealed that there was a small, select secret group within the vast membership of the Divine Nine. This group was referred to as the Boule.
You can only work like a Hebrew slave, but you'll receive none of the perks. They're still cursed. Follow the way of the Messiah, not the prophets. Then I had to remember why it was so hard for me to receive the Messiah at first. 90s hood movies, their contribution to confusion. The 90s gave us quite a few to choose from, but I thought that we could learn quite a bit if we just look at the first three to come out and what they helped to establish as far as mindset and mind state.
I can't take the smell, can't take the noise, got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with the touch of repossessed my car.
When Melly Mel famously declared that it was akin to navigating a dense jungle at times, he probably never could have fathomed that the inhabitants of this metaphorical jungle would go so far as to label themselves as savages, a striking testament to the complexities of human behavior and perception. The embrace of negativity and self-destructive tendencies stands as unequivocal indicators of a profound psychological disorder, painting a grim portrait of the mental landscape. Remarkably akin to the notorious Stockholm Syndrome in some aspects, this unsettlingly selective racial affliction curiously lacks any formal medical nomenclature, underscoring the peculiar intricacies of its manifestation and impact. Our contemporary struggle, it becomes increasingly evident, is not merely a worldly battle, but a deeply rooted spiritual one, reaching down to its very core. The annals of the African American community's past and the blueprint for its future rest steadfastly upon a bedrock of unwavering faith. It is not imperative that all individuals interpret Scripture in precisely the same manner or congregate within identical fellowships, but rather, the imperative lies in avoiding the perils of atheism through the perilous journey of self-deification and steering clear of the corrosive undercurrents of anti-Christian sentiment. Much of the tribulations endured through history, as well as those that await us, serve as integral components of a transformative refinement process. Our own proclivity for disobedience and our unwavering resolve to tread the path of those who pledge oaths lead inexorably toward the precipice of self-destruction, a dire trajectory that can only be halted through genuine repentance. It is high time that we cease unwittingly assuming the roles and characteristics that malevolent forces would have us embody, mere carbon copy caricatures serving the designs of devils bent on our detriment.
Hood movies, as it were, help to plant a seed of Antichrist. Now, whether you want to get into the argument of what you want to say his name was or not, that's another subject for another video. The thing that we can all agree on is that young people today are being pushed further and further away from God, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they have been indoctrinated by images in the media that either vilify or in some way calumniate the name of Christ. They deride Christ all throughout media, not just American media, media worldwide.
And it's something that was, again, it's part of a Luciferian construct and a Luciferian agenda. Because we believe in that, we can have this conversation. Now, for those who don't believe that it's a Luciferian agenda, then many parts of what we're going to talk about tonight may not make any sense to you at all. But for those of us who do know and understand that until you understand that the construct is a Luciferian construct from the top of the pyramid down, from the capstone down, until you understand that, everything else you think you know will only confuse you. And that includes white supremacy, and that includes racism in general. And one of the reasons that there are things aimed at particular ethnic groups is because it takes different things sometimes. You know, it may take a fisherman a different type of bait to catch a particular fish. And the devil understood that. You know, it is a beautiful and godly thing that God created so many different, or God allowed for so many different types of cultures to exist and to thrive, and so many different ethnic groups, ethnos, the Bible calls them, to be able to be made manifest as proof positive of his ability to create as the creator. He is most creative. But the adversary, using the old black and white chessboard tactic and technique, knows how to flip things out of order and then pit one side, or create sides, and then cause for one to have conflict with another. So another passion of mine through this ministry has been to break down those walls of communication, those walls of information, those walls of understanding, to speak to folks from my community. I'm from Detroit, from the ghetto, and I remember what it was like to be a young kid in the ghetto, growing up and wanting to see certain images of yourself and your quote-unquote culture, but not seeing those images, always seeing the same types of images. And I can remember the excitement I had when black filmmakers began to make these movies that we call 90s hood movies. Of course, I was a younger man then, and I only had a certain understanding of certain things. And when you're younger, you have, you know, that's the time when you're supposed to learn things by experience. And some of those experiences will be good things, some will be bad things. Ultimately, we hope that they lead you back to God, as oftentimes it takes adversity to lead people to God. So and you know, no one here should be a stranger to that, but we don't think of the adversity as being questioning who you are or where you come from or your importance in the world or your history. That is something that we can say, well, that's not a good thing, but we can also say that the alcoholism that brought some people to the Lord was not a good thing, or the drug addiction that brought some people, or the infidelity that brought some people, or the whatever the issue in a person's tissue may have been that brought them to the Lord. You know, the unbelief, whatever it was, it wasn't good in a lot of our cases. So let's have patience for the young folks who need to go through this stage. And, you know, I'm speaking to them, and I'm also speaking to the entire Christian community at large. Because what you can do best, if you don't fall into that category, is to just help by letting us have this conversation and not feeling that it's in any way contributing to anything negative concerning race relations, but that we have to let them ask questions so that they can get the answers that they need, just as we did, and like I would have wished that I had when I was younger.
I don't want to go to another planet. I'd rather fix this one.
You don't know your past, you won't know your future. Every man
like the winds are changing.
Change is good.
Yeah, but it's not easy. I know what I have to do, but going back means I'll have to face my past. I've been running from it for so long. Ow! Jeez, what was that for?
It doesn't matter. It's in the past.
Yeah, but it still hurts.
Oh, yes, the past can hurt. But the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. Ah! You see? So what are you going to do?
There is no Wakanda or Wakandan salute. You are doing a burial pose. It is part of a brotherhood ritual to symbolize that the old you is dead, and like Osiris, you will be resurrected as Horus. This is a perfect disguise for MK Ultra, alter personality programming. The symbols relate, as this is a dead man's pose. Yet another sign that Hollywood and the powers that should not be would like for the old you to be X'd out. Do you know of the homosexual act that Horus allowed his uncle Set to perform on him? Told of in the Book of the Dead. Occultists have the real Egyptian stories, and I've read them. They feed the majority of us, the masses, mere fairy tales. And Horus gave up his tail like a fairy. Devils do not use Hollywood or television programming to empower you, nor do they allow black elite slaves free reign to do so. And there is your X on your dead god Osiris, god of fertility or the underworld, hell, or whatever it is, with crook and flail, cone-headed, and green as pea soup. If you think these extra-dimensional beings were your ancestors, well, maybe you descended from a slithering Slytherin. Giants, hybrids, part fallen angels, part beasts, necromancers, idolaters, and respecters of persons. Only select individuals got to be a part of the mystery systems. The rest of the folks were working class folks, just a little bit over the level of slave, and some below the level of slave. While the kings or the royalty, those with that bloodline, were exalted, draped in gold, worshipped even after death, blinded by the insanity and pride of vanity, vaingloriously worshiping only that which reminds you of self. You wanted a king, that's why Yah came in the flesh and became Messiah. And his yoke is easy, and his burden is light. Ashamed to follow Christ, yet proud to be Israelite. And you can actually do as Christ did in even greater works.
Stop it right now. We ain't got no time for no tears. Ain't nobody gonna have no pity on you just because you're going blind.
As a former star student of the esoteric who is deeply experienced and now firmly convinced of the potential spiritual pitfalls within the New Age movement, the Age of Aquarius, or the Aeon of Horus, I feel compelled to address the concerns surrounding these beliefs. There is a significant apprehension among those in Christian ministry, and it's crucial to understand these concerns. One prevailing critique centers on the perceived influence of the New Age movement within organizations like Freemasonry, often associated with a fixation on the Age of Aquarius. Critics argue that this concept serves as a covert vehicle to repackage and disseminate what they term Luciferianism to a global audience. This is a serious concern, and one that we should approach with caution and vigilance. Throughout history, influential mystic figures like Manly P. Hall, Aleister Crowley, Alice Bailey, formerly associated with the Lucifer Trust, now known as Lucis Trust, Madame Blavatsky, and Brother Annie Besant have been linked to esoteric and occult beliefs, which some argue have connections to these New Age ideologies. While these associations may not be universally accepted, they underline the concerns expressed by many discerning observers regarding the spiritual nature of these movements. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, the Bible reminds us, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness?" This verse underscores the importance of maintaining a clear distinction between our faith in Christ and any spiritual beliefs or practices that could lead us away from the teachings of the Bible. While some individuals may be drawn to the ideas associated with the Age of Aquarius or the Aeon of Horus, it is our duty as people of the Most High God to encourage discernment, critical thinking, and a deep reliance on the Word of God. The Bible cautions us about deceptive teachings and the potential for spiritual deception. In 2 Corinthians 11:13-14, it warns that Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. It's crucial to address how New Age beliefs and practices can sometimes infiltrate our lives almost imperceptibly. The subtlety with which these ideas slip past our radar and into our homes is a matter of great concern. Often, they are presented as harmless, even attractive, self-help, or spiritual concepts that promise personal growth, inner peace, and enlightenment. Yet, beneath the surface, there can be profound deviations from faith in the Almighty. They may invade the home via books, computers, self-help workshops, or even from acquaintances who may be unaware of the spiritual dangers involved. Let's delve deeper into Alice Bailey's contributions to the New Age movement and the well-founded concerns from a Christian perspective regarding the potential dangers associated with her teachings. Alice Bailey's writings hold a central place in the New Age movement, particularly in her exploration of spiritual evolution and enlightenment. Her concepts, such as humanity's path toward higher consciousness and the upcoming Age of Aquarius, may be appealing to those seeking personal growth and spiritual development. However, from a Christian standpoint, there are deeply rooted concerns regarding Bailey's association with the Lucifer Trust, now known as Lucis Trust. Despite Bailey's intention to redefine Lucifer as a symbol of enlightenment and spiritual awakening, this interpretation directly contradicts traditional Christian beliefs. In Christian theology, Lucifer is often identified with Satan, the adversary of God and the embodiment of evil. Consequently, Bailey's redefinition of Lucifer as a positive spiritual force is perceived as a significant deviation from orthodox teachings. These deviations can lead individuals away from the foundational truths in God's Word. Her burden was to evangelize the nations, and did so in her work through the United Nations. She was an evangelist for the Luciferian way. Those who go down that left-hand path profess that they serve the God of this world and not the God of heaven. They have convinced masses of people to serve that deceiving God and to rebel against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just as the devil himself had done. Most of them do so unintentionally. Their submission to every desire of their flesh has allowed many to adopt the creed of Aleister Crowley. They do what they will, when they want. They would never surrender to a lord, even if he was their bloodline ancestral king. Lucifer, rising, even in the ghetto, little do they know, and godlessness follows.